Attention! You are about to know one of the most surprising and impressive stories of the World War II, a deep study of the most recent documentation discovered. Before we start, tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is. And if you like stories like this one, subscribe to the channel for more daily documentaries. Ready? Now turn up the volume and let's begin. The winter of 1944 was unforgiving in the Ardennes. Snow blanketed the dense forest. Temperatures hovered well below freezing, and visibility was often reduced to mere yards. Against this harsh backdrop, the United States Army positioned its forces along what was considered a quiet sector of the front lines. Among these units was the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, a segregated African-American unit that would soon find itself at the center of one of the most remarkable yet overlooked stories of World War II. Major James Wilson, a white officer from Massachusetts, commanded the battalion of primarily black soldiers. He had been assigned to the unit in early 1944, just prior to their deployment to Europe. The military hierarchy of the time ensured that nearly all officers in black units were white, a reminder of the rigid segregation that defined the American armed forces during the war. Despite Wilson's initial reservations about leading a black unit, he had come to respect the professionalism and skill of his men. They had proven themselves repeatedly since landing at Normandy in July of that year. Staff Sergeant William Jefferson led Battery A, a 29-year-old former schoolteacher from Georgia who had enlisted shortly after Pearl Harbor. Jefferson was known for his calm demeanor and methodical approach to artillery calculations. His counterpart in Battery B was Staff Sergeant Marcus Collins, a 26-year-old from Mississippi with natural leadership abilities that had earned him rapid promotion despite the military's reluctance to elevate black servicemen to positions of authority. First Lieutenant Thomas Daniels served as Wilson's executive officer. As one of the few black officers in the unit, having graduated from Officer Candidate School in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, Daniels navigated the complex racial politics of the Army with remarkable diplomacy. His presence was a source of quiet pride among the enlisted men, many of whom had never before seen a black man with officers' insignia. By December 1944, the 333rd had established positions near Schoenberg, Belgium. They were supporting elements of the 106th Infantry Division, which was spread thinly across a 27-mile front. Unknown to American commanders, they were directly in the path of what would become known as Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West, the Ardennes Offensive, or as history would later call it, the Battle of the Bulge. The battalion maintained 5 155mm howitzers, massive artillery pieces capable of firing 95-pound shells nearly 15,000 yards. They had practiced their craft diligently, earning a reputation for exceptional accuracy and rapid response to fire missions. In the quiet weeks preceding the German offensive, they had constructed sturdy log bunkers, dug in their positions, and established a rotation that allowed small groups to visit nearby villages for brief respites from the cold and monotony of the front lines. No one expected what was about to happen. Not the high command in Paris, not the division commanders, and certainly not the men of the 333rd, who would soon face the most challenging test of their lives, one that would reveal both the depth of their courage and the painful reality of serving a nation that treated them as second-class citizens, even as they fought and died beneath its flag. In a small wooden church in Schoenberg, converted to a temporary mess hall, Private First Class Robert Johnson, a 22-year-old from Detroit, wrote a letter to his mother on the evening of December 15th. "Dear Mama," he wrote, "the weather here is colder than anything I've ever known, but the men keep each other's spirits up. Captain Edwards says we might get Christmas packages soon. I miss your sweet potato pie something fierce." He could not have known that within 48 hours many of his comrades would be dead, captured, or scattered in desperate flight across the snow-covered Ardennes. First Sergeant Harold Washington, a 34-year-old veteran from Chicago who had served in the peacetime army before the war, sensed something was wrong. The previous evening, he had noticed unusual patterns of German patrols and reported his concerns to Captain Edwards, who forwarded them to battalion headquarters. The response had been dismissive. Intelligence officers at division level were convinced that the Germans were incapable of mounting a major offensive. Washington knew better, but military hierarchy offered little opportunity for a black non-commissioned officer to challenge the assessment of white officers far removed from the front lines. As darkness fell on December 15th, the men of the 333rd settled into their routine. Those not on duty huddled in their bunkers, played cards, wrote letters, or simply tried to stay warm. None realized that less than 5 miles away, nearly 250,000 German troops with over 1,000 tanks were preparing to launch an assault that would catch the American forces completely by surprise. The German plan, conceived by Hitler himself, aimed to split the Allied armies by driving a wedge through the American lines in the Ardennes, then turning north to recapture the port of Antwerp. Success would deprive the Allies of their primary supply port and potentially force a negotiated peace. It was a desperate strategy, but one that initially achieved stunning success against unprepared American forces. At precisely 05:30 hours on December 16th, the pre-dawn silence was shattered by a massive artillery barrage. The sky lit up as thousands of German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. The ground shook beneath the impact of countless shells, and the air filled with the screech of incoming projectiles and the thunderous explosions as they found their marks. Private Johnson was awakened by the first impacts. He grabbed his helmet and rifle, stumbling from his bunk as dirt and splinters rained down from the ceiling of the bunker. "They're coming!" shouted Corporal Davis from the doorway. "Everyone to positions." The initial bombardment lasted nearly 2 hours, systematically targeting American command posts, artillery positions, and supply depots. Communication lines were severed, units isolated, and confusion reigned as German infantry, supported by tanks, began pushing through gaps in the American lines. Major Wilson received reports of German breakthroughs to the north and south of their position. The 106th Division was rapidly disintegrating under the weight of the German assault. By mid-morning, Wilson faced a critical decision: withdraw to avoid encirclement or stand and fight to buy time for other units to establish defensive positions further west. The order to withdraw came at 1100 hours. Battery A and Battery B were to displace immediately to positions near Bastogne, 25 miles to the southwest. Battery C and the service battery would remain to support elements of the 106th Division that were still fighting, then withdraw along a predetermined route. The withdrawal quickly turned chaotic. German armored columns had already cut several key roads. Artillery units, with their heavy equipment, faced particular challenges navigating the narrow, icy roads of the Ardennes. Sergeant Jefferson led Battery A southwest, while Sergeant Collins directed Battery B along a parallel route. They fought through sporadic German ambushes, navigated around destroyed bridges, and pressed on through deteriorating weather conditions. By nightfall, the situation had become desperate. Major Wilson, traveling with Battery B, received reports that Battery C and the service battery had been overrun. Lieutenant Daniels, who had been with Battery C, was reported missing along with most of his men. Only scattered groups of survivors were making their way west, pursued by German units. December 17th dawned with heavy snow and near-zero visibility. Battery A and Battery B had become separated during the night. Sergeant Jefferson, with 3 howitzers and 47 men, reached the outskirts of Bastogne, only to find the city under threat of encirclement by rapidly advancing German forces. Sergeant Collins and Battery B, with Major Wilson and 2 remaining howitzers, were 10 miles northeast, their path to Bastogne blocked by German armored units. It was here, on the frozen crossroads near the town of Houffalize, that their war would take an unexpected turn. It was here that the men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion would demonstrate extraordinary courage and skill that would save hundreds of lives, yet remain largely unrecognized for decades to come. What unfolded over the next 72 hours would test the limits of human endurance and challenge the deeply ingrained prejudices of a segregated army. The actions of these black artillerymen would ultimately help decide the fate of Bastogne and the outcome of Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West. Yet their story would be overshadowed, their sacrifices minimized, and their heroism forgotten until historians began re-examining the Battle of the Bulge decades later. This is their story, a tale of courage under fire, of perseverance against overwhelming odds, and of men who fought for a freedom they themselves had not fully experienced. These were the men of the 333rd, the Black Artillery Battalion that helped save Bastogne in America's darkest hour of the European campaign. The morning of December 17th found Major Wilson and the remnants of Battery B in a precarious position. They had established a makeshift defensive perimeter in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine forest. Their two remaining howitzers were positioned to cover the approach from the east, where German forces were expected to appear at any moment. The 43 men of the battery, all that remained from an original complement of over 100, were exhausted from 24 hours of continuous movement, combat, and the bitter cold that had settled over the Ardennes. "Check your ammunition and prepare for visitors," Wilson ordered, his voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. "We hold until relieved or ordered to withdraw." The men understood the implications. With German forces between them and Bastogne, there was nowhere to withdraw to. They were on their own. First, Sergeant Collins moved among the men, checking positions and offering quiet encouragement. "Keep your heads down and your eyes open," he advised. "When they come, let the officers know exactly what you see. Numbers, vehicles, direction." Collins had been with the battalion since its formation at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, in 1942. He had seen his men grow from raw recruits into skilled artillerymen, overcoming not just the challenges of warfare, but also the constant burden of proving themselves in an army that questioned their very capability based solely on the color of their skin. At approximately 0900 hours, Private Samuel Lewis, manning an observation post at the edge of the clearing, spotted movement through the trees. "Vehicles approaching from the northeast," he reported. "Sounds like tanks." Major Wilson climbed a small rise to observe. Through his field glasses, he could make out the distinctive silhouettes of German Panthers. 5 of them, accompanied by perhaps a company of infantry. "They haven't seen us yet," Wilson whispered to Collins, who had joined him on the rise. "If they continue on their current heading, they'll pass about 400 yards to our north." It was a sliver of good fortune in what had been a disastrous 48 hours. Then, from beyond the advancing German column, came the unmistakable sounds of an American unit engaged in combat. The distant crack of M1 rifles and the chatter of Browning machine guns told Wilson that fellow Americans were fighting for their lives, likely unaware of the German armor moving to outflank them. "That's the 2nd Battalion, 327th Infantry," Wilson said, consulting his map. "They must have been cut off during the withdrawal." The 327th was part of the 26th Infantry Division, elements of which had been rushed forward to stem the German advance. If the Panthers reached their position, the entire battalion, over 500 men, would be in grave danger. Wilson faced an impossible choice. Revealing their position by engaging the German column would almost certainly result in the destruction of what remained of Battery B. Remaining hidden would condemn an entire infantry battalion to potential annihilation. The major glanced at Collins, seeing in the sergeant's eyes that they had reached the same conclusion. "Prepare to engage," Wilson ordered, returning to the battery position. "Target the lead and rear vehicles first, then shift to the infantry." The men moved with practiced efficiency, swinging the massive barrels of the howitzers toward the approaching threat. Gun crews checked their ammunition, calculated firing solutions, and awaited the command to fire. "Sir," Collins said quietly as Wilson prepared to give the order, "request permission to deploy forward observers." Forward observation was dangerous work under the best circumstances. In their current situation, with German forces all around them, it approached suicide. Yet accurate artillery fire would be impossible without observers adjusting their aim. Wilson hesitated only briefly. "Permission granted, Sergeant. Select your men." Collins nodded and turned to the battery. He needed volunteers who could move quietly through enemy territory, observe the effects of artillery fire, and relay corrections, all while avoiding detection by an alert enemy. 3 men stepped forward immediately: Corporal James Davis, Private First Class Raymond Carter, and Private George Williams. All had served as forward observers in previous actions. All understood the risks. With minimal equipment, just binoculars, maps, and a single radio, they slipped into the forest, working their way toward positions that would give them clear views of the German column and the American unit beyond. 30 minutes later, the radio crackled with Davis's voice. "Observer 1 in position. Target vehicles at coordinates Lima Tango 473891. Infantry dispersed along road for 300 yards east and west of vehicles. American forces approximately 800 yards northwest of target, engaging enemy infantry from prepared positions." Wilson confirmed the coordinates and gave the order to fire. The first howitzer roared, sending its 95-pound high-explosive shell arcing toward the distant German column. Seconds later, the second howitzer added its voice to the deadly chorus. The shells fell short, impacting in the forest approximately 100 yards from the lead Panther. "Adjust fire," came Davis's calm voice over the radio. "Up 100, right 50. The gun crews made the corrections, reloaded, and fired again. This time the shells found their mark. The lead Panther erupted in flames as a direct hit penetrated its relatively thin top armor. The last vehicle in the column, hit almost simultaneously, blocked the road behind. The remaining 3 Panthers immediately began scanning for the source of the unexpected artillery fire. The German infantry scattered for cover, momentarily forgetting their engagement with the American forces to their northwest. It was exactly the disruption the surrounded infantry battalion needed. "Fire for effect," Wilson ordered, and both howitzers began a rapid sequence, their crews working with choreographed precision to maintain a steady rate of fire. Shell after shell rained down on the trapped German column. Panthers were designed to withstand frontal assault, but their top armor proved vulnerable to plunging artillery fire. A third tank erupted in flames. The fourth was disabled by a near miss that destroyed its tracks. Only one remained operational, and it was reversing desperately off the road, seeking cover in the dense forest. The German infantry, caught in the open and subjected to a devastating artillery barrage, broke and retreated eastward. The immediate threat to the American infantry battalion had been neutralized, but Battery B's position was now compromised. The surviving German forces would inevitably regroup and seek the source of the artillery fire that had decimated their column. "Observers, return to battery," Wilson ordered over the radio. "All personnel, prepare to displace immediately." Their brief stand had bought precious time for the surrounded infantry, but now they needed to move before German reinforcements arrived. As the forward observers made their way back through the forest, Corporal Davis encountered an American officer, Captain Richard Miller of the 327th Infantry. "Where the hell did that artillery come from?" Miller demanded, his expression a mixture of relief and disbelief. "You just saved our asses. 333rd Field Artillery, Battery B," Davis replied. "Major Wilson's compliments, sir. We observed your situation and intervened." Miller shook his head in amazement. "The 333rd? You're the colored unit, aren't you?" Davis nodded, his expression neutral despite the familiar sting of the question. "Well, I don't care if you're purple," Miller continued. "You just saved my entire battalion. We were cut off, running low on ammunition, and that armor would have rolled right over us." He extended his hand, a gesture that crossed the rigid boundaries of the segregated army. "Thank you, Corporal." Davis took the offered hand. "Just doing our job, sir, but you should know we're cut off too, and the Germans will be looking for us now." Captain Miller nodded thoughtfully. "Then perhaps we can help each other. Bring Major Wilson to meet with Colonel Harkins. I think we need to coordinate our movements if any of us are going to make it to Bastogne." Within the hour, a hasty conference had established a plan. The infantry battalion would provide protection for Battery B's howitzers as they moved southwest toward Bastogne. In return, the artillery would deliver fire support as needed. It was an arrangement born of desperation, but one that would prove fortuitous for both units. By nightfall, the combined force was moving cautiously through the dense Ardennes forest. German patrols and checkpoints had to be avoided or neutralized silently. The wounded, both infantry and artillerymen, were transported on improvised sleds pulled through the snow. Progress was agonizingly slow, but they were moving towards safety, toward Bastogne, where elements of the 101st Airborne Division were establishing a defensive perimeter around the critical road junction. What neither Major Wilson nor Colonel Harkins could know was that Bastogne itself was in grave danger. German forces were closing in from all directions. The city's defenders were outnumbered and outgunned. Their situation was rapidly becoming desperate. The arrival of an additional infantry battalion and 2 functioning howitzers would soon prove to be a pivotal moment in one of the most famous stands in American military history. As dawn broke on December 18th, the situation in Bastogne had reached a critical juncture. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, found his forces surrounded and under mounting pressure from German attacks on all sides. The city's strategic importance as a road junction made it a primary objective in the German offensive. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the road network necessary for rapid movement through the Ardennes. McAuliffe's greatest concern was artillery support. The division had arrived in Bastogne with minimal artillery, having been rushed from reserve positions in France. They faced German forces with substantial artillery assets and were steadily losing the ability to counter enemy fire. What McAuliffe did not yet know was that help was coming, not just from the expected direction, but from the forest to the northeast, where a mixed force of infantry and artillery was fighting its way toward the besieged city. Sergeant William Jefferson and the men of Battery A had reached Bastogne's outer defenses late on December 17th. Their 3 howitzers were immediately integrated into the city's defensive plan, positioned on the southwestern edge of the perimeter to counter expected German attacks from that direction. But 3 guns were insufficient for the task at hand. The defenders needed more artillery, desperately. At approximately 1100 hours on December 18th, perimeter guards reported movement in the forest to the northeast, a sector where German attacks had been anticipated. Defensive positions were reinforced, and artillery was adjusted to target the approach. As the figures emerged from the tree line, however, it became clear they were Americans, exhausted, frostbitten, but moving with purpose toward the Allied lines. "Hold your fire!" shouted a lieutenant from the 327th as the column approached the defensive positions. "Friendlies coming in!" "We've got wounded." The arrival of Colonel Harkins's battalion and Major Wilson's artillery battery was met with astonishment and immediate relief. Though reduced in strength, the infantry battalion added over 400 combat-effective troops to Bastogne's defenses. More significant, however, were the 2 155mm howitzers that Battery B brought with them, powerful weapons that would dramatically enhance the defenders' ability to counter German attacks. The reunion of Battery A and Battery B was emotional. Sergeant Jefferson had feared his comrades lost when communication failed during the chaotic withdrawal. Major Wilson similarly had been unable to confirm if Jefferson's men had reached safety. Now the surviving elements of the 333rd were reunited, their combined strength providing a crucial artillery component to Bastonia's defense. General McAuliffe personally welcomed Colonel Harkins and Major Wilson to his headquarters, a basement in Bastonia's central area that had been converted to a command post. "Gentlemen, your arrival could not have been more timely," McAuliffe said. "We're surrounded, outgunned, and expected to hold this position indefinitely." He gestured to a map showing German forces encircling the city. "Your artillery will make a significant difference." Major Wilson outlined his unit's capabilities and limitations. "We have 5 operational 155mm howitzers, General. Ammunition is limited, approximately 200 rounds distributed among the guns. We've lost most of our transport and supporting elements, but the gun crews are intact and ready to resume operations." McAuliffe nodded thoughtfully. 200 rounds isn't much, Major. We'll need to be judicious in their use." He turned to his artillery officer. "Integrate the 333rd's howitzers into our defensive plan immediately. Priority targets will be enemy armor concentrations and assembly areas." As Wilson left the meeting to oversee the redeployment of his guns, McAuliffe held him back momentarily. "Major, I understand your unit is a colored battalion." It wasn't a question, but Wilson nodded confirmation. "Are there any special considerations I should be aware of regarding their deployment?" The question reflected the reality of the segregated army, where black units were often relegated to support roles and separated from white troops, even in combat zones. Wilson's response was immediate and firm. "Only one, sir. My men are artillery specialists. Point them at the enemy, and they'll deliver accurate fire. That's the only consideration that matters right now." McAuliffe studied Wilson's face, then nodded. "That's good enough for me, Major. We're all wearing the same uniform here." Within hours, the howitzers of the 333rd were integrated into Bastonia's defensive fire plan. They were positioned strategically to cover likely avenues of German attack, with particular attention to the eastern approaches, where intelligence indicated the heaviest pressure would come. Ammunition was carefully inventoried and distributed, each precious shell accounted for and designated for specific target categories. At 1400 hours, the first major German assault since the arrival of Wilson's batteries began. A battalion of German infantry, supported by 15 tanks, advanced from the east toward the perimeter, defended by elements of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. The paratroopers, armed primarily with small arms and a few bazookas, were ill-equipped to counter such a concentration of armor. The call for artillery support came urgently over the radio network. Sergeant Jefferson's Battery A responded immediately, their shells landing with precision among the advancing German formation. The first volley destroyed 2 tanks and scattered the supporting infantry. Subsequent volleys targeted infantry concentrations, forcing them to disperse and lose cohesion. From his observation post on the eastern perimeter, Lieutenant Colonel James Harper of the 501st witnessed the effectiveness of the artillery support. "Whoever is on those guns knows their business," he remarked to his operations officer. "That's the most accurate fire support we've had since this whole mess started." The German attack faltered and ultimately withdrew after losing 5 tanks and suffering heavy infantry casualties. Similar scenarios played out across Bastonia's perimeter throughout the day, as German probing attacks tested the defenses and were repulsed with the critical assistance of the 333rd's howitzers. By nightfall, word had spread among the defenders about the Black Artillery Unit, whose precision fire had helped blunt multiple German attacks. Soldiers who might have harbored racial prejudices found those attitudes difficult to maintain when their lives had been saved by the skill and courage of black artillerymen. In the crucible of combat, the artificial barriers of segregation began to erode, if not disappear entirely. That evening, as temperatures plunged well below freezing, Sergeant Collins supervised the rotation of gun crews to ensure his men received what little rest was possible. The howitzers required constant attention in the bitter cold, with mechanisms that could freeze and render the weapons inoperable at the most critical moments. "Keep the breech blocks covered when not firing," Collins instructed his crews. "Check the recoil mechanisms hourly. If the hydraulic fluid congeals, we're out of action." The men nodded, understanding the technical challenges posed by the extreme conditions. As Collins completed his rounds, he encountered a group of paratroopers bringing hot coffee and rations to the gun positions. An unexpected gesture of appreciation from men who had benefited directly from the artillery support earlier in the day. "Thought you fellas could use something warm," said a sergeant from the 101st, offering Collins a steaming cup. "That was some shooting today. Saved a lot of our boys." Collins accepted the coffee gratefully. "Just doing our job, Sergeant. Same as you." The paratrooper nodded. "Well, we're damn glad you're doing it here. Word is, you fought your way through German lines to get to Bastogne. That true?" "Something like that," Collins replied, his natural reticence asserting itself. In his experience, white soldiers often became uncomfortable when reminded of the capabilities of black troops, as if it challenged some fundamental aspect of their worldview. The paratrooper, however, seemed genuinely appreciative. "Listen," the paratrooper said, lowering his voice slightly. "Some of the boys were wondering. We heard you lost a lot of your people getting here. Battery C and your service battery?" Collins nodded, his expression somber. "Overrun on the first day. We haven't had confirmation of their status." He didn't add what they all suspected, that those who hadn't made it to Bastogne were likely either dead or prisoners of war. "Tough break," the paratrooper said. "For what it's worth, you've got the respect of the 101st. We don't care what color you are. You're keeping those German tanks off our backs, and that's what matters." He extended his hand, a simple gesture that nonetheless crossed a boundary rarely traversed in the segregated military of 1944. Collins shook the offered hand, a brief smile crossing his otherwise serious features. "Appreciate that, Sergeant. We'll keep them off as long as we've got shells to send downrange." Such interactions, multiplied across Bastogne's defensive perimeter, represented a subtle but significant shift. In the desperate circumstances of the siege, with survival dependent on mutual support and coordinated action, the artificial distinctions of race began to recede in importance. Men were judged not by their color, but by their contribution to the collective defense, their courage, skill, and determination. As December 19th dawned, the defenders of Bastogne faced another day of German attacks, ammunition shortages, and bitter cold. But they faced it together, a diverse force united by common purpose and growing mutual respect. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, once seen as just another segregated black unit assigned to support roles, had become an integral and respected component of Bastogne's defense, their howitzers representing the difference between survival and annihilation for the encircled garrison. Help us take this story to more people. Like the video, comment if you already knew about this case, and subscribe to the channel. Now we return to the point where everything changed. The morning of December 20th brought deteriorating weather conditions. Heavy snow reduced visibility to less than 100 yards, and temperatures hovered around 10 degrees Fahrenheit. For the defenders of Bastogne, the weather was both blessing and curse. It grounded the Luftwaffe, preventing German air attacks, but it also prevented Allied air support and resupply. Within the perimeter, the situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Ammunition for all weapons was critically low. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and the growing number of wounded strained the limited facilities. Food was strictly rationed, and fuel for vehicles and heating was almost gone. Yet morale remained surprisingly high, bolstered by small victories and the knowledge that Allied forces were fighting to break through to the besieged city. At the command post, General McAuliffe, met with his staff and unit commanders to assess their status and allocate dwindling resources. Major Wilson represented the 333rd, bringing a sobering report on ammunition levels. "We're down to 47 high-explosive rounds, General," Wilson reported. "At current rates of expenditure, that's less than 1 day's worth of support." McAuliffe nodded grimly. Similar reports came from other unit commanders. Small arms ammunition at 30%, mortar rounds nearly exhausted, anti-tank weapons critically low. "We need to be even more selective with our fire support," McAuliffe concluded. "Artillery will be reserved for critical situations only, major armor threats or infantry concentrations that threaten to breach the perimeter." As the meeting concluded, a staff officer entered with an urgent message. "Sir, German officers approaching our lines under a flag of truce. They're requesting a meeting to discuss terms for our surrender." The room fell silent. McAuliffe's expression hardened. "Surrender? Nuts!" he exclaimed. After a moment's reflection, he added more formally, "We're in excellent shape for a counterattack. Take that message back to the German commander." The now famous response energized the defenders. When word spread through Battalion that McAuliffe had rejected the surrender demand with a single contemptuous word, it reinforced their determination to hold out. For the men of the 333rd, it was a moment of pride. They were part of a defiant stand that would soon enter military legend. Throughout the day, German pressure increased on all sides of the perimeter. With artillery ammunition severely limited, the defenders relied increasingly on small unit tactics, close-range engagements, and the skillful use of terrain to repel attacks. The howitzers of the 333rd remained silent, except when absolutely necessary, each precious shell saved for the most critical targets. At 15:30 hours, the most serious threat of the day developed on the southern perimeter. A battalion-strength force of German infantry, supported by 7 tanks, advanced through the snow toward positions held by the 327th Infantry, the same unit that had fought its way to Bastogne alongside Battery B of the 333rd. Colonel Harkins immediately requested artillery support, knowing the precarious ammunition situation but recognizing that his rifles and machine guns could not stop the tanks. The request reached Battery B, where Major Wilson and Sergeant Collins faced an agonizing decision. They had just 18 shells remaining, a precious reserve that might be needed elsewhere at any moment. "They need support now," Collins argued, studying the map where the German attack was plotted. "Without it, they'll be overrun within 30 minutes. Wilson nodded, making his decision. 6 rounds, Sergeant. Make them count." It was a compromise, enough to disrupt the attack, perhaps, but maintaining a minimal reserve for future emergencies. Collins personally supervised the firing, ensuring that each shell was precisely targeted for maximum effect. The first volley, 3 shells, landed among the advancing infantry, causing immediate casualties and forcing them to scatter. The second volley targeted the lead tanks, scoring a direct hit on one and disabling it. The remaining tanks hesitated, then continued their advance more cautiously. The brief artillery barrage had disrupted the German attack's momentum, but not stopped it entirely. The tanks continued to advance, now more widely spaced and using available cover. Infantry reformed and resumed their movement toward the American lines. Colonel Harkins reported that the situation remained critical. It was at this moment that Sergeant Jefferson from Battery A approached Major Wilson with an unexpected proposal. "Sir, we've been examining the German shells that have impacted within our perimeter. Some are 105mm, nearly identical in dimension to our 155mm cases. With modification, we might be able to recover and repurpose them." The suggestion was unorthodox, even dangerous. Artillery shells were precision munitions, not designed for improvisation. Using modified cases could result in misfires, premature detonations, or catastrophic barrel failures. Yet the desperate situation demanded creative solutions. "How quickly could you implement this?" Wilson asked. "We've already begun, sir," Jefferson replied. "Sergeant Collins's gun crews are collecting unexploded German ordnance and bringing it to our position. We've established a makeshift workshop to modify the cases. First test firing should be possible within 2 hours." Wilson considered the risks versus the potential benefits. "Proceed, Sergeant, but with extreme caution. Test fire from a single gun with reduced crews and maximum safety precautions. I want all non-essential personnel at least 100 yards from the position." The improvisation efforts continued throughout the afternoon and into the evening. The artillerymen, many with backgrounds as mechanics, metal workers, or engineers in civilian life, applied their skills to the dangerous task of repurposing enemy ammunition. German 105mm cases were carefully modified to accept American propellant and projectiles. It was painstaking work, performed in freezing conditions with inadequate tools, but driven by the knowledge that their comrades' lives depended on maintaining artillery support. At 1800 hours, the first test firing was conducted. A single modified shell was loaded into the breech of a howitzer designated for testing. The gun crew took positions well away from the weapon, using a long lanyard to trigger the firing mechanism remotely. The test round fired successfully, though with noticeable differences in performance compared to standard ammunition. "Reduced range and accuracy," Jefferson reported after examining the results. "Approximately 70% of normal velocity, with corresponding adjustments needed for targeting, but serviceable in emergency conditions." By midnight, the improvisation team had successfully modified 37 German shells for use in American howitzers. It wasn't a permanent solution. Each shell required extensive modification, and there were limits to how many suitable German shells could be recovered, but it provided a crucial extension to their dwindling ammunition supply. The morning of December 21st brought a renewed German offensive against Bastogne. Attack after attack tested the perimeter, searching for weaknesses in the American defenses. The modified ammunition was put into service, deployed selectively against the most critical threats. Despite reduced accuracy, the psychological impact of continued artillery support bolstered the defenders' morale while demoralizing the attackers, who had expected American artillery to fall silent as supplies were exhausted. Throughout the day, the men of the 333rd worked continuously, firing their guns, recovering enemy ordnance, modifying shells, and maintaining their increasingly worn equipment. They operated on minimal rations and little rest, pushing through exhaustion, with the knowledge that the entire defense of Bastogne partially depended on their continued function. By evening, weather conditions finally began to improve. The heavy snow tapered off, and forecasts suggested clearing skies for the following day. For the defenders, it was the first hopeful sign in nearly a week of siege. Clear weather meant the possibility of air resupply and close air support, if they could hold out just a bit longer. As darkness fell on December 21st, the men of the 333rd, like all of Bastogne's defenders, endured another night of intermittent shelling, probing attacks, and bitter cold. They did so with growing confidence that help was coming, that their desperate improvisation and stubborn resistance had not been in vain. What they could not yet know was that their actions had already contributed significantly to one of the most famous defensive stands in American military history, and that the coming day would bring both salvation and recognition of their critical role in holding Bastogne. December 22nd dawned clear and cold over Bastogne. For the first time in days, visibility extended for miles, revealing the surrounding countryside blanketed in snow and the distant columns of smoke that marked German positions. The improved weather brought immediate changes to the tactical situation. At approximately 1000 hours, the distinctive drone of aircraft engines became audible over the city. Looking up, defenders saw the welcome sight of C-47 transport planes approaching from the southwest, escorted by P-47 Thunderbolt fighters. Operation Repulse, the emergency aerial resupply of Bastogne, had begun. Brightly colored parachutes blossomed against the blue sky as hundreds of supply bundles descended toward designated drop zones within the perimeter. Artillery ammunition was the highest priority, with medical supplies, rations, and small arms ammunition close behind. For the men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, the resupply represented salvation, a chance to resume full support operations without the dangerous improvisations of previous days. Sergeant Collins organized recovery teams to collect artillery shells from the drop zones and transport them to gun positions. Despite continued German shelling, the teams worked efficiently, prioritizing ammunition recovery above all else. By noon, each howitzer had received a basic load of 30 rounds, a dramatic improvement over their previous situation. The air resupply continued throughout the day, with multiple flights of C-47s dropping critically needed supplies. Simultaneously, fighter bombers attacked German positions around the perimeter, striking concentrations of armor and artillery that had been systematically mapped by Bastogne's defenders during the siege. Major Wilson received updated intelligence at the afternoon command briefing. General Patton's Third Army was driving northward toward Bastogne, with advance elements expected to reach the city within 48 to 72 hours. The mission for Bastogne's defenders remained unchanged, hold at all costs, but now there was a definite time frame for relief. The Germans, aware that time was running out for their opportunity to capture Bastogne, launched their most determined attacks yet that afternoon. Multiple assault groups hit the perimeter simultaneously, seeking to exploit any weakness before Allied reinforcements could arrive. The heaviest attack came from the southwest, where a reinforced company of Panzer Grenadiers, supported by 6 tanks, struck positions held by elements of the 101st Airborne. The call for fire support went out immediately, and the 333rd responded with their newly replenished ammunition. Batteries A and B delivered a coordinated barrage that caught the German infantry in the open, inflicting heavy casualties and disrupting their assault formation. The tanks continued to advance, but were met with a combination of artillery fire and bazooka teams that had been positioned to counter exactly such a threat. From his observation post, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Strayer of the 506th Parachute Infantry watched as the precision artillery fire broke the German attack. "Those colored boys can shoot," he remarked to his radio man. "Make sure they get credit for this one." By 1700 hours, all German attacks had been repulsed with significant losses to the attackers. Bastogne's perimeter remained intact, its defenders reinforced with fresh supplies and renewed determination. The consensus among the command staff was that the worst had passed. If they could maintain their positions for just 2 more days, relief would arrive. That evening, General McAuliffe made a point of visiting the positions of the 333rd. He moved from gun to gun, speaking briefly with the crews and expressing his personal appreciation for their contribution to Bastogne's defense. "Your performance has been exemplary," he told Major Wilson as they walked between positions, "particularly your unit's initiative in repurposing German ammunition. That kind of resourcefulness saved lives." Wilson acknowledged the compliment with a nod. "My men are professionals, General. They did what was necessary under difficult circumstances." "They've more than proven themselves," McAuliffe replied. "I intend to mention the 333rd specifically in my reports." It was a significant gesture, formal recognition of a black unit's contribution at a time when such acknowledgement was rare. As McAuliffe departed, Sergeant Jefferson approached Major Wilson. "Sir, we've just received word from the command post. Battery C survivors have been identified among a group of wounded evacuated by air today. Wilson's expression reflected both relief and concern. "How many? What's their condition?" "7 men, sir, including Lieutenant Daniels, all wounded but stable. They report that they were overrun on December 17th. Most of the battery was killed or captured, but they managed to escape along with a few others who didn't survive the journey." The news was bittersweet, confirmation that at least some of their missing comrades had survived, but also that many others had not. Battery C and the service battery had borne the brunt of the initial German onslaught, sacrificing themselves to buy time for the withdrawal of other elements. "Have Lieutenant Daniels brought to my position when his condition permits," Wilson ordered. "I want a full report on Battery C's actions during the breakthrough." The following morning, December 23rd, brought increased aerial activity and the distant sound of heavy gunfire from the south. Patton's forces were fighting their way toward Bastogne, meeting determined German resistance, but making steady progress. Within the perimeter, the defenders maintained their vigilance, repelling smaller-scale German attacks and improving their positions with the expectation of holding for at least another day. Lieutenant Thomas Daniels was brought to the command post in the afternoon, his left arm in a sling and his face bearing the marks of exposure and exhaustion. Despite his injuries, he insisted on providing a complete account of Battery C's last stand near Schönberg. "We were in position approximately 2 miles east of Schönberg when the attack began," Daniels reported. "Captain Edwards ordered us to maintain fire support for elements of the 106th Division that were being overrun. We fired continuously for nearly 4 hours, targeting German armor and infantry concentrations." Daniels described how German forces had eventually flanked their position, forcing Battery C to displace under direct fire. "We lost 3 guns immediately. The remaining 2 continued firing until their ammunition was exhausted." His voice faltered slightly as he recounted the final moments. "Captain Edwards ordered the remaining men to withdraw through the forest, while he and a volunteer crew provided covering fire with small arms. That was the last I saw of him." Daniels and 16 men had attempted to reach American lines, moving west through increasingly difficult terrain as German forces closed in from all sides. "We encountered a German patrol on the second day. There was an exchange of fire. We lost 8 men and became separated in the forest. The remaining group, myself and 7 others, continued southwest, avoiding roads and German positions. 2 more died from wounds before we encountered an American patrol from the 4th Armored Division yesterday." Major Wilson listened intently, his expression grave. "Your men performed admirably, Lieutenant. Battery C's stand bought critical time for other units to establish defensive positions. It was cold comfort in the face of such losses, but it acknowledged the significance of their sacrifice." As December 23rd progressed, reports from reconnaissance indicated that elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division were now less than 5 miles from Bastogne's southern perimeter. The mood within the city lifted noticeably as the prospect of relief became imminent rather than theoretical. At the evening command briefing, General McAuliffe outlined plans for coordinating with the relief column when it arrived. "We'll need to provide fire support to cover their final approach," he explained. "The Germans will make every effort to prevent the link-up, so we must be prepared to counter significant opposition." Major Wilson confirmed that the 333rd was prepared to deliver supporting fire as needed. With ammunition stocks replenished by airdrops, they could now provide comprehensive coverage of likely approach routes. Specific targeting assignments were distributed, with the 333rd responsible for covering the southern approaches where the 4th Armored was expected to make contact. As darkness fell on December 23rd, the men of Bastogne maintained their vigilance, knowing that the coming day might bring either relief or the most desperate fighting yet. For the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, it represented the culmination of a week-long ordeal that had tested their courage, skill, and resourcefulness beyond anything they had previously experienced. What they could not know was that their actions, From the initial engagement that saved the 327th Infantry to their innovative reuse of German ammunition during the siege, would eventually be recognized as crucial contributions to the defense of Bastogne. More immediately, they faced one final day of determined resistance before relief could arrive. The German forces, aware that the window for capturing Bastogne was closing rapidly, would make their most desperate effort yet to break the perimeter before Patton's forces could arrive. The men of the 333rd prepared for this final challenge, checking their howitzers, organizing ammunition, and establishing communication with forward observers. They had come too far and sacrificed too much to falter now on the eve of relief. Whatever the coming day might bring, they were determined to meet it with the same courage and professionalism they had demonstrated throughout the siege. Dawn on December 24th, Christmas Eve, brought renewed German attempts to break Bastogne's perimeter before relief forces could arrive. Multiple attacks probed the defenses, seeking any vulnerability that might be exploited for a final breakthrough. The heaviest pressure came from the southeast, directly opposing the expected route of the 4th Armored Division. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was fully engaged from the earliest hours, delivering precision fire to disrupt German assembly areas and advancing formations. Their effectiveness had only increased with the replenishment of ammunition and the opportunity for gun crews to rest and recover from the exhaustion of previous days. At 1000 hours, Major Wilson received a priority fire mission from the command post. German armor was massing approximately 3,000 yards south of the perimeter, directly in the path of the advancing American relief column. If not dispersed, it threatened to prevent the 4th Armored from reaching Bastogne. All batteries, fire mission, Wilson ordered. Grid coordinates, Kilo Romeo 587324. German armor concentration, battalion fire for effect. Both batteries acknowledged the order and swung their howitzers to the new targets. Within minutes, a coordinated barrage was falling on the German assembly area, disrupting their preparation and forcing tanks to disperse. The effectiveness of the fire was confirmed shortly afterward by forward observers, who reported multiple vehicles destroyed and the remaining forces abandoning their assembly positions. It was a critical intervention that significantly reduced the opposition facing the relief column. Throughout the morning, similar scenarios played out across Bastogne's perimeter. German attacks were met with determined resistance, supported by artillery fire that disrupted formations and neutralized key threats. The defenders, sensing that relief was imminent, fought with renewed energy and confidence. At 16:30 hours, the long-awaited moment arrived. Elements of Combat Command R, 4th Armored Division, made contact with outposts of the 101st Airborne on Bastogne's southern perimeter. The siege was broken. After more than a week of encirclement, constant combat and extreme hardship, the defenders of Bastogne had held until relief arrived. Word of the breakthrough spread rapidly throughout the city, greeted with celebrations despite continued German pressure on other sections of the perimeter. At the positions of the 333rd, the news was received with quiet satisfaction rather than overt jubilation. The men continued to man their guns, knowing that their job was not yet complete. The entire perimeter had not been secured, and German forces still threatened from multiple directions. As evening approached, the first elements of the relief column entered Bastogne itself. Tanks and half-tracks of the 4th Armored rolled through streets lined with exhausted but cheering defenders. Supply vehicles followed, bringing desperately needed ammunition, medical supplies, and rations. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding Combat Command R of the 4th Armored, established contact with General McAuliffe at the command post. Their meeting was brief and focused on immediate operational concerns, securing the corridor to Bastogne, evacuating wounded, and preparing for continued combat operations. Following this initial conference, McAuliffe introduced Abrams to the key unit commanders who had contributed to Bastonia's defense. Major Wilson represented the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, providing a concise summary of his unit's actions during the siege. Abrams, known for his direct manner, asked pointed questions about the 333rd's fire support operations and their improvisation with captured German ammunition. His professional interest was evident, as was his respect for their accomplishments under extreme conditions. "Your unit performed exceptionally, Major," Abrams concluded. "Artillery support makes all the difference in defensive operations, and from what I'm hearing, yours was first-rate." It was a professional soldier's acknowledgement of excellence, delivered without reference to the battalion's status as a segregated black unit, a focus on performance rather than race that represented the meritocratic ideal of combat, if not the reality of the Army's structure. As Christmas Eve progressed, the immediate tactical situation continued to evolve. The corridor to Bastogne remained narrow and vulnerable to German counterattacks. Relief forces established defensive positions alongside the original defenders, preparing for the inevitable German reaction to the breakthrough. The 333rd maintained its fire support role, now coordinated with additional artillery assets from the 4th Armored Division. Their local knowledge, detailed familiarity with the terrain surrounding Bastogne, and the pattern of German deployments proved invaluable to the newly arrived forces. That evening, as limited Christmas observances were held throughout Bastogne, Sergeant Collins gathered with his gun crews near their positions. There were no formal services, no special meals, no gifts or decorations, just exhausted men sharing a brief moment of reflection amid the ongoing demands of combat. "We made it this far," Collins told them quietly. "Not all of us, but enough to complete the mission. That's something to be proud of." The men nodded in solemn agreement, thinking of comrades lost during the withdrawal and the siege, members of Battery C and the service battery who had been overrun, forward observers who hadn't returned from missions, gun crews hit by German counter-battery fire. A private from the gun crew spoke up, his voice barely audible. "Do you think they'll remember what we did here, Sergeant? When the war's over, I mean." Collins considered the question carefully before responding. "The Army has a short memory for some things," he said finally. "But the men we fought alongside, they'll remember, and that matters more than any official recognition." It was a realistic assessment from a man who understood the racial dynamics of the military and the country it represented. The contributions of black units were often overlooked or minimized in official accounts, their achievements attributed to white commanders or simply omitted from the narrative. Yet something different had emerged in Bastogne, a recognition based on demonstrated capability rather than preconception, on actions rather than assumptions. As Christmas Day, 1944, dawned over Bastogne, the battle was far from over. German forces continued to press against the narrow corridor, attempting to re-isolate the city. The 333rd remained fully engaged, supporting both defensive operations and efforts to expand the corridor. Their war would continue for months, through the final defeat of the German Ardennes offensive and into the push toward Germany itself. What had changed, however, was their place within the narrative of Bastogne's defense. They were no longer just a segregated artillery battalion assigned to support roles, but recognized contributors to one of the most celebrated defensive actions in American military history. Their performance under the extreme conditions of the siege, their resourcefulness, precision, and determination had earned the respect of units that might previously have dismissed their capabilities based solely on race. This recognition would not immediately translate into institutional change. The segregated structure of the military would persist until President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948. Official accounts of the Battle of the Bulge would often minimize or omit the contributions of black units like the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. Yet, within the community of Baston's defenders, the truth was known and acknowledged. The artillery support that had repeatedly saved infantry positions from being overrun, that had broken up German armor concentrations threatening the perimeter, that had continued even when ammunition was nearly exhausted through innovative reuse of German shells. That support had come significantly from the black artillerymen of the 333rd. As the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion in the spring of 1945, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion continued to support operations with the same professionalism and effectiveness they had demonstrated at Bastogne. They would end the war with an impressive record of combat service from Normandy through the Ardennes and into Germany itself. The full recognition of their contributions would come only decades later, as historians reassessed the Battle of the Bulge with more attention to previously overlooked units and individuals. The improvisation with German ammunition, in particular, would eventually be acknowledged as a crucial factor in maintaining Baston's artillery capability during the most desperate days of the siege. For the men themselves, however, the most meaningful recognition came from their fellow soldiers, the infantry they had supported, the commanders who had witnessed their effectiveness, and the other artillery units alongside whom they had served. In the shared experience of combat, they had found a measure of the equality that American society still denied them. They had proven, through action rather than argument, that courage, skill, and determination were not determined by race. The story of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion at Bastogne represents both the reality of racial discrimination in World War II America and the potential for that discrimination to be overcome through demonstrated capability and shared purpose. It is a complex legacy that honors their specific achievements while acknowledging the systemic barriers they faced, a legacy that continues to resonate as America confronts its ongoing challenges with racial equity and inclusion. In the freezing forests of the Ardennes in December 1944, the men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion helped save Bastogne. In doing so, they not only contributed to a crucial military victory, but also advanced, in their own way, the longer struggle for recognition and equality. Their shells struck targets beyond the German lines. The impact of their service would eventually reach much further. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. For the men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, like countless other American service members, the focus shifted to returning home and resuming civilian lives interrupted by global conflict. They departed Europe having compiled an exemplary combat record, including their crucial role in the defense of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. Their return to the United States, however, brought a jarring contrast to their experiences overseas. Men who had been essential to victory, who had earned the respect of their white comrades in combat, found themselves once again subject to Jim Crow laws and pervasive discrimination. The uniform that had marked them as American soldiers did not shield them from the systematic racism that defined much of post-war America. Staff Sergeant Marcus Collins returned to Mississippi to find that his military service counted for little in a society structured around racial hierarchy. Despite his combat experience and demonstrated leadership, employment opportunities remained limited to those deemed appropriate for Black Americans. Public facilities were segregated, voting rights were obstructed, and violence against black citizens who challenged these restrictions was common and often unpunished. Lieutenant Thomas Daniels, one of the few black officers in the unit, faced similar challenges in his return to civilian life. His commission and combat experience provided no exemption from the everyday indignities of segregation. In some instances, still wearing his uniform with combat decorations, He was required to yield space to white civilians on public transportation or denied service in establishments that served whites only. Major James Wilson, the white commanding officer who had come to respect and advocate for his black artillery unit, returned to a society that largely did not want to hear about the capabilities and contributions of black servicemen. His attempts to secure appropriate recognition for the 333rd met with institutional resistance and bureaucratic obstacles. Citations were downgraded, accomplishments attributed to broader unit actions rather than specific black contributions, and the innovative reuse of German ammunition, a crucial factor in Bastonia's defense, was mentioned only in passing in official accounts, if at all. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion itself was deactivated in 1946 during the rapid post-war demobilization of the army. Its personnel were discharged or reassigned, and its accomplishments became a footnote in the broader narrative of World War II. The segregated structure of the military remained intact, despite the demonstrated effectiveness of black units in combat roles. It would require President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948, motivated by both civil rights considerations and the practical lessons of World War II, to begin the process of military desegregation. Even then, implementation was gradual and often reluctant, with full integration not achieved until well into the 1950s. The veterans of the 333rd, like many black World War II veterans, found themselves participating in a different kind of struggle after returning home. The emerging civil rights movement that would eventually transform American society. Their military service provided both practical skills and moral authority for this new battle. Men who had faced enemy fire in defense of democracy abroad were increasingly unwilling to accept its denial at home. Sergeant William Jefferson became involved in voter registration efforts in Georgia, using his status as a veteran to encourage other black citizens to demand their constitutional rights. His military bearing and quiet confidence made him an effective advocate, though it also made him a target for those resistant to change. In 1952, after successfully registering dozens of black voters in his county, he was beaten by white supremacists and warned to stop stirring up trouble. Undeterred, he continued his civil rights work throughout the 1950s and 60s. Private First Class Robert Johnson returned to Detroit and used the GI Bill to obtain training as an automotive mechanic. When initially denied employment at a major manufacturing plant despite his qualifications, he organized fellow black veterans to challenge discriminatory hiring practices. Their collective action, leveraging both their status as veterans and growing public support for civil rights, eventually secured changes in employment policies and opportunities for black workers in Detroit's industrial sector. For decades, the specific contributions of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion at Bastonia remained largely unrecognized in public accounts of the battle. The iconic status of the 101st Airborne Division in popular narratives of the siege often overshadowed the crucial role of supporting units, particularly segregated black units. Films, books, and official histories focused predominantly on white contributions to the defense, reflecting both the racial attitudes of the era and the limitations of contemporary documentation. It was not until the 1970s, as both military and academic historians began reassessing World War II with greater attention to previously marginalized perspectives, that the role of black units in the European theater received more comprehensive examination. The innovative use of recovered German ammunition by the 333rd during the siege of Bastonia was finally acknowledged as a significant factor in maintaining artillery support during the most critical phase of the defense. By the 1990s, with most of the original participants aging or deceased, more complete accounts began to emerge. Interviews with surviving members of the battalion, examination of unit records, and correlation with other eyewitness accounts allowed historians to reconstruct the full extent of the 333rd's contributions. The battalion's actions in saving the 327th Infantry during the initial German breakthrough, their determined defense during the siege, and their coordination with relief forces were finally documented in historical accounts that acknowledged the racial context of their service. In 2002, a memorial service at Arlington National Cemetery honored the veterans of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion with specific recognition of their role at Bastogne. The few surviving members, now elderly men, received formal acknowledgement of their service from military and government representatives. It was a belated but meaningful recognition of their place in American military history. The story of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion reflects both the persistent racism that defined much of 20th century America and the potential for that racism to be overcome through shared purpose and demonstrated capability. In the extreme conditions of combat, particularly the desperate defense of Bastogne, racial barriers temporarily receded as survival depended on mutual support and coordinated action. The respect earned by black artillerymen from white infantry they supported represented a momentary realization of meritocratic ideals often proclaimed but rarely practiced in American society. Yet the return to segregation and discrimination after the war illustrated how deeply entrenched racial hierarchy remained, how resistant to change despite the shared sacrifice of military service. The struggle for full recognition of black contributions to American military success paralleled the broader civil rights movement, both seeking to hold America accountable to its stated principles of equality and opportunity. Today, as America continues to confront its complex racial history and persistent inequities, the story of the 333rd offers both inspiration and caution. It demonstrates the capabilities and courage of black Americans when given opportunity to serve, while also revealing the systematic barriers erected to minimize their recognition and advancement. It shows how crisis can temporarily suspend prejudice when survival depends on utilizing all available talent, while also showing how quickly those prejudices can reassert themselves when the crisis passes. Most importantly, it reminds us that American history includes many overlooked contributions from those who served despite discrimination, who demonstrated excellence despite restricted opportunity, and who helped preserve American democracy while being denied its full benefits. The artillery shells fired by the 333rd at Bastogne have long since expended their force, but the impact of their service and our recognition of it continues to resonate in America's ongoing effort to create a more perfect union. The voices that still echo from that desperate winter in 1944 speak of courage, resourcefulness, and determination. They speak of men who served a nation that did not serve them equally, who fought for ideals not yet fully extended to their own communities. They remind us that America's military achievements have always depended on diverse contributions, many of which have gone unrecognized for too long. In listening to these voices from the past, we honor not just their specific service at Bastogne, but also their place in the longer struggle for equality that continues to shape American society. Did you like this story? Your support helps us continue producing new documentaries. A like, a comment, or a share makes all the difference. If you're not already a subscriber, join our community. See you in the next episode.